Before we start, I want you to do something. Close your eyes and picture Brazil. The football team, the nation, the idea of Brazil on a football pitch. You see yellow. Of course you see yellow, that vivid, sunlit, unmistakable canary yellow that has been woven into the identity of this sport so deeply that you cannot separate the color from the country. 5 World Cups, Pelé, Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Rivaldo, Romario, Neymar, Vinicius Jr., all of them draped in that golden shirt, the most iconic uniform in the history of sport. The jersey that every kid in every country in the world has wanted to wear at least once in their life. Now forget it. Because 76 years ago, Brazil didn't play in yellow. Brazil played in white. Plain, simple, unremarkable white. And the reason they changed, the reason the most famous jersey in football exists at all, is a story so dark, so strange, and so layered with coincidence and heartbreak that if you wrote it as fiction, nobody would believe you. This is the story of how a football match killed a color, how a nation erased white from its identity overnight, and how the shirt that replaced it, the shirt that went on to conquer the world 5 times over, was designed by a teenager who was secretly cheering for the enemy. July 16, 1950, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The Maracanã Stadium has just been built. It is the largest sports arena on the planet, and today for the final match of the 1950 World Cup, it holds nearly 200,000 people. 200,000. Try to picture that number inside a single building. You can't. The human brain doesn't process crowds of that size. It just registers them as a wall of noise and color and body heat, pressing inward from every direction. The stadium is so full that people are sitting on the concrete stairs, standing in the aisles, hanging from the rafters. Outside, millions more are gathered around radios in bars, in homes, in town squares, in factories that have shut down for the afternoon because nothing is more important than this match. Brazil need only a draw against Uruguay to become world champions for the first time. A draw. Not even a win. Just don't lose. The newspapers have already printed the celebration headlines. Brazil, world champions, in thick black type, bundled and ready for distribution the moment the final whistle blows. The president of Brazil has written his speech. The victory parade route has been planned. The entire country has pre-celebrated with the serene confidence of a nation that has never once considered the possibility that things could go wrong. The players walk out in their white shirts. White shirt, white shorts, blue trim. The kit Brazil has worn since their first international match in 1914. Unremarkable. Clean. Familiar. Friaca scores for Brazil in the 47th minute. The stadium detonates. 200,000 people screaming at a volume that people outside the ground later said they felt more than heard. Brazil are ahead. The coronation has begun. And then, in the 66th minute, Juan Alberto Schiaffino equalizes for Uruguay. The noise drops, not to silence, to confusion, a murmur. 200,000 people recalculating. It's fine, a draw is enough, we're still champions. We just need to hold on. They couldn't hold on. 79th minute. A Uruguayan striker named Alcides Gidja takes the ball down the right wing. He cuts inside. He shoots. Goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa dives. The ball passes under his body and into the net. 2-1 Uruguay. And then something happened that has never happened before or since in the history of sport. 200,000 people fell completely, absolutely, profoundly silent. Writers who were inside the Maracanã that day spent the rest of their careers trying to describe that silence. One Brazilian journalist wrote that it was like standing inside a cathedral where the congregation had just been told that God was dead. Another said it felt like the air had been removed from the stadium, as though the building itself had stopped breathing. People fainted in the stands. People collapsed. Reports from the day suggest that at least 2 spectators died of cardiac arrest inside the stadium during the final minutes. The match ended, Uruguay celebrated, and 200,000 Brazilians sat in their seats, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to reconcile what had just happened with the reality they had spent weeks constructing in their minds. They called it the Maracanazo, the Maracanã blow. And it didn't just change Brazilian football. It changed the way an entire nation saw color. In the days that followed, Brazil did what people do when they experience trauma too large to process rationally. They looked for something to blame. The first target was Moacir Barbosa, the goalkeeper, the man who had let Gigia's shot pass under his body. Barbosa was not merely criticized. He was erased. He was removed from the national team. He was refused entry to the team's training facilities. Restaurants in Rio de Janeiro would not serve him. Strangers would cross the street to avoid walking near him. He spent the remaining 50 years of his life carrying the weight of a nation's failure on his shoulders, alone, unforgiven. 2 decades after the match, Barbosa somehow obtained the wooden goalpost from the original Maracanã pitch, the actual post that stood behind him when Gigia scored. He took them to his home, and he burned them, in his backyard, trying to incinerate the physical evidence of the worst moment of his existence. It didn't help. When Barbosa died in 2000, 50 years after the Maracanazo, the Brazilian press noted that he had lived his final years in poverty and near total isolation. The last line of his obituary could have been a novel. He once said, "In Brazil, the maximum sentence for a crime is 30 years. I have served 50. But Barbosa was not the only target. There was a second object of blame, something less human and easier to destroy. The white shirt. The reasoning was emotional, not logical. But emotions don't need logic to reshape a country. Brazil wore white when they lost. Therefore, white was the problem. White was weak. White was passive. White was the color of surrender, of hospitals, of sheets pulled over the faces of the dead. White had no personality, no identity, no fight. White was, in the minds of a grieving nation, the reason their team stood on the pitch looking like ghosts while Uruguay celebrated in beautiful sky blue. The white jersey didn't just fall out of favor. It was actively rejected, banished, treated as a cursed artifact that needed to be buried. No Brazilian fan wanted to see it. No player wanted to wear it. The very sight of a white football shirt with a blue collar provoked a physical reaction in a population still raw from the worst sporting humiliation in their history. For 3 years, Brazilian football existed in a kind of identity limbo. They needed a new kit. Everyone agreed on that. But nobody could agree on what it should look like. And so in 1953, the Rio de Janeiro newspaper Correio da Manhã took matters into its own hands. They announced a national design competition, open to the public. One rule: the new jersey must incorporate all 4 colors of the Brazilian flag: yellow, green, blue, and white. Thousands of entries arrived, from professional designers, from amateurs, from school children, from factory workers, from anyone with a pencil and a piece of paper and an opinion about what Brazil should look like when it walked onto a football pitch. And the winner, out of all those thousands, was a 19-year-old illustrator from the southern city of Pelotas named Aldir Garcia Schlee. His design was simple: a yellow shirt with green collar and cuffs, blue shorts, white socks, all 4 flag colors present. Nothing revolutionary on paper. But on a football pitch, in motion, under lights, it was electric. The yellow blazed. It glowed. It looked like sunlight had been stitched into fabric. It was the opposite of everything the old white shirt had represented. Passive, neutral, invisible. This shirt demanded to be seen. They called it the Canarinho, the little canary. And here is the detail that makes this entire story feel like it was written by a screenwriter with a cruel sense of humor. Aldir Garcia Schlee was from Pelotas, a city that sits directly on the Brazilian border with Uruguay. And because of the 1950 World Cup, because of the Maracanazo, because of the very match that had caused the competition to exist in the first place, Schlee had become a Uruguay supporter. The 19-year-old who designed the most famous shirt in Brazilian football history was a fan of the team that destroyed Brazil. He didn't tell anyone at the time. He kept it quiet for decades. But in later interviews, long after the yellow shirt had won 5 World Cups and become the most iconic piece of sports clothing on the planet, Schlee admitted the truth. The Maracanazo didn't make him hate Uruguay. It made him admire them. He was a teenager on the border, watching a tiny country defeat a giant, and he fell in love with the underdog. And then he designed the jersey for the giant, and the giant wore it to conquer the world. The Canarinho made its World Cup debut in 1954 in Switzerland. Brazil wore it, lost in the quarterfinals, and went home. No magic yet. The shirt was still just a shirt. 4 years later, everything changed. 1958, Sweden. Brazil reached the World Cup final. Their opponents were the hosts, Sweden, who also played in yellow. Someone needed to change. The obvious solution was for Brazil to wear their old white kit. The Brazilian Football Confederation refused. Absolutely, categorically refused. The scar from 1950 had not healed. 8 years later, the mere suggestion of wearing white in a World Cup match provoked something close to panic in the Brazilian delegation. The trauma was that deep. The superstition was that powerful. So officials went out into the streets of Solna, the Stockholm suburb where the final was being played, and bought plain blue t-shirts from local shops. They brought them back to the hotel. They sat down with needles and thread, and they hand-stitched the Brazilian football badge onto each shirt, one by one, creating a makeshift change strip in a hotel room the night before the most important match in their country's history. Brazil walked out for the 1958 World Cup final in hand-stitched blue shirts bought from a Swedish shop. And then a 17-year-old named Pelé scored twice, and Brazil won 5-2, and the world changed forever. But the yellow shirt, the shirt they couldn't wear that day because Sweden wore yellow too, became immortal anyway. Because over the next 12 years, in that shirt, Brazil won 3 World Cups, 1958, 1962, 1970. The greatest dynasty football has ever seen, wrapped in canary yellow. 5 World Cups, 73 years, the most recognizable jersey in any sport on earth. And it exists because 200,000 people went silent in a stadium in 1950, and a country decided that the color white was cursed. Everything about the Canarinho, the yellow that glows under floodlights, the green trim that represents the forests, the blue shorts that represent the sky above Rio, all of it traces back to a single moment of unbearable loss. The most beautiful shirt in football was born from the ugliest day in Brazilian history. And the boy who drew it, the 19-year-old on the border, the Uruguay fan who never told anyone, who watched his design become the most famous piece of sports apparel on the planet, he lived to be 86 years old. He died in 2018, in the same border town where he was born, having spent 65 years knowing a secret that would have made half a continent furious if they'd known it at the time. He designed Brazil's soul, and he was quietly cheering for Uruguay the entire time. Next time you watch Brazil play, look at the yellow. Really look at it. See the way it catches the light. See the way it moves on the pitch. See the way every other national team's jersey looks slightly duller when Brazil walk onto the same grass. That yellow is not decoration. It's not branding. It's not a design choice made in a boardroom by a sportswear company. That yellow is a scar, a beautiful, radiant, world-conquering scar, stitched over a wound that was so deep an entire country had to change its skin to survive it. The Maracanazo took everything from Brazil. Their confidence, their goalkeeper's life, their relationship with an entire color. And from the wreckage, a 19-year-old boy, secretly a fan of the enemy, drew a little yellow bird on a piece of paper. And the Canarinho flew.